Today's workshop will be focusing on healthy and safe relationships, reading the signs. So we'll be starting by talking about the relationship spectrum and then moving into what are some warning signs that really early on in the relationship, just as you're starting to date or get to know someone, that someone might not be a healthy person, it might not be a healthy dynamic that you would like to pursue. And what are the signs that this is a healthy person and this is a potentially healthy relationship? So really looking at some of the details to be aware of around that. And then also just your own awareness and boundaries and developing trust in yourself. And then we'll also be talking just briefly about resources available in our community and outside of our community and making sure that we attend to your questions. So this is the spectrum of relationships. So relationships exist on a long continuum. It's not just two buckets of healthy or abusive. There's a lot of gray or orange in between. So on one side, we have healthy relationships, and we'll be talking more in depth, but I like to use little hand signals. So this is my hand signal for healthy relationships. As we move into unhealthy to toxic relationships, the hand signal starts to go like this a little bit. And then as we move into abusive and very dangerous relationships, my hand signal goes like this. And I will talk a little bit more about that. So the quality of healthy relationships. So in healthy relationships, we have two equal partners that come together, and this relationship is based on respect and equality. There's a lot of really good communication in a healthy relationship. People feel like they can openly communicate. They feel safe and comfortable and free to share their thoughts, their feelings, their inner experiences. People are actively listening in a healthy relationship, so seeking to understand, not just seeking for their turn to talk or a road in to prove the other person wrong, but they really want to mutually understand each other. There are many displays of empathy and caregiving. So again, a healthy relationship is marked by two people who really understand each other's feelings. They try to see things from the other person's perspective. They give support, they take care of each other. But it's a healthy, balanced, reciprocal caretaking. It's not one-sided. There's not scorekeeping. It feels very free. It feels like a choice, and it feels very balanced. They respect each other. So in a healthy relationship, this person that you're in a relationship with is somebody that you would want to be friends with if you weren't romantically involved with them. So you value their belief system. You think that they're a decent person at the end of the day. You value and you honor their values and their perspective on life and the choices that they make. And likewise, they think those things about you. They really want your opinion. They really want to hear what you think about different decisions that they're making. They want to gather your input. You're a trusted confidant, and they are your trusted confidant. And that leads us to mutual trust. So this is a person that you can count on, and they know they can count on you. There's a little bit of a vault system around emotional feelings and situations and stories. So this is a person that you can really be vulnerable with. You feel safe being vulnerable with them, and you know that they're not going to use the information that you share against you, and they're not going to share that information with other people. They're protective of your privacy. A healthy relationship involves honesty. So this is telling the truth for sure, that not only do you tell the truth, but you feel comfortable telling the truth, whether that's telling the truth about something that happened, or if that's telling the truth about how you feel, if that's telling the truth about something that's not quite right in the relationship. Because in a healthy relationship, there is still conflict. There are no two people in this world who are exactly the same and look at the world exactly the same way. And so conflict is bound to arise. But in a healthy relationship, when there's conflict, There's an increase of communication. People are really trying to understand where the other person is coming from. And there is a desire on both parties to be able to compromise, to be able to negotiate, to mutually problem solve, to find a solution that works for both people. And so feeling free to be honest and be able to have those conflicts because there aren't really uncomfortable or dangerous consequences that result. This is also being honest about who you are. You feel like you can be your authentic self. You can share the truest parts of yourself. You don't feel like you have to hide certain qualities or aspects of who you are as a person or things that are important to you in order to be accepted by your partner. So there's this authenticity that feels really open and comfortable. There's privacy in healthy relationships. So even though this is most likely the person that you share most with, there's still things that we just keep privately to ourselves, and that's okay. Things are just for us, and those boundaries are respected. In healthy relationships, both partners practice accountability. So we all make mistakes, we're all human. And it's really important in order to have a healthy relationship to be able to acknowledge when you've made a mistake, when you've stepped on someone's toes, when you have crossed a line, and to be able to repair any damage that's been done, taking responsibility for those mistakes and taking responsibility for yourself to make the changes that are needed so that that damage doesn't repeat itself in the future. There are equal standards. So everybody plays by the same rules in a healthy relationship. There isn't this sense of a double standard or do as I say and not as I do. Everybody's operating with the same framework, the same rules, the same understanding, the same value system. And there's independence inside and outside of the relationship. And so in a healthy relationship, there are individual goals, relationships, activities, hopes and dreams. And then there are those that you share as a couple. So there are couple goals, there are couple friendships, there are couple activities, there are couple hopes and dreams. When there's too much of individuality and not enough togetherness, then we get out of balance. Similarly, if there's too much togetherness and not enough individuality, that can also be an unhealthy balance. And so in a healthy relationship, it feels like a nice balance where you still have your independence and your own identity, but you also have an identity as a couple and an interdependence between the two partners. And partners share responsibilities and make decisions together about finances, parenting, life choices in general. So again, healthy relationship, we have two equal partners that are working together as a team to move forward. An unhealthy relationship, so that middle area of the spectrum. And this is the hand motion that I tend to use for unhealthy or toxic relationships because there is a back and forth often of attempts to be in control, either one person trying to be in control of the other, or sometimes it goes back and forth where there's some competition for control in the relationship. When a relationship is moving into this unhealthy area of the spectrum, often what we see are breaks in communication. So maybe there's silent treatment, maybe there's shutting down, maybe there's only listening to be able to respond or listening for their turn and not really seeking to understand the other person. There may be pressure, so things like guilt trips, things like nagging, things like always questioning someone else's boundaries or limits. Instead of accepting and respecting those boundaries and limits. There's some dishonesty. So again, whether that's outright kind of classic version of not telling the truth about a situation or dishonesty about parts of themselves. So hiding aspects of their lives, hiding aspects of their day, their relationships with other people. It doesn't feel like the information is free flowing. There's struggles for control, so attempts to potentially be in charge of the partner partnership. And that can go back and forth, or that can be one partner towards the others. Inconsiderate behavior. So this is behavior that's not quite to the level of abusive, but just thoughtless. So, not really making decisions without really considering the other person's needs or the other person's schedule. So an example of this might be something like scheduling to go out with your friends before checking to make sure that your partner doesn't have to work late, and that somebody is going to be home to care for the kids. So kind of making your own plans without consideration of how that impacts other people. Competitiveness. So sometimes in an unhealthy relationship, we see either by one party or both parties the need to be right, the need to win, or the need to get your way. Scorekeeping. So keeping track of who's doing what. There's often, this really goes hand in hand with the sense of competitiveness, but who's doing more, trying to cite examples of how one person might be contributing more to the relationship than the other, pointing out examples of where the other partner is falling short, things like that. Mistrust, so having difficulty believing the other person for a variety of reasons. So this could sometimes look like jealousy, or this could go further than that, where maybe there's things that have happened in the past where trust has been broken, and maybe there wasn't accountability and repair of the damage that was done. And so that turns into an ongoing feeling that it's really hard to trust and believe that this person is going to do what they say they're going to do. Smothering can be a quality of an unhealthy relationship. So feeling like, again, there's not that good balance between independence and interdependence, that maybe there's an expectation that most of your time or more time than you would like is spent with your partner, as opposed to being able to pursue your individual activities and goals and relationships. So again, unhealthy relationship, we have this kind of back and forth where maybe one partner is trying to be in control of the other, or trying to make most of the decisions, or it could go back and forth where they kind of take turns. And then we move into abusive relationships. So abusive relationships are based on an imbalance of power and control. So one partner is clearly in control and holds the power, and the other partner is not, and often feels fearful of the abusive partner. One partner makes all of the decisions, and there are consequences for disagreement. So conflict does not go well in abusive relationships, and it's not really tolerated in abusive relationships. That's definitely an opportunity where abusive partners will use abusive tactics to regain power and control. Accusations are made. So oftentimes very misguided, no reasonable evidence for these accusations. Oftentimes they are around infidelity. You're cheating, I know you're with other people, you're talking to other people, things like that. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. So minimizing is when an abusive partner makes it seem like their abusive behaviors aren't that abusive. They're not that big of a deal. So they might say things like, oh, you're being too overdramatic, or can't you take a joke, or geez, you're so emotional, things like that, when they have clearly engaged in an abusive behavior to make it seem like the problem is with their partner and not with themselves. Denying, so never happened, we never had that conversation, I never said that, I don't know what you're talking about. Or blaming is when they shift responsibility back on to the non-abusive partner. So this can happen with statements like, well, if you could just keep the kids quiet, I wouldn't get so upset and yell at you. Or, if you were able to keep this house clean, then I wouldn't get so stressed out. So when they've had this big blow up, when they've engaged in abusive behavior, they look for excuses to justify their abusive behavior, and oftentimes they blame their partner for causing those. Isolation can be a big component of abusive relationships. So in order to maintain power and control, abusive partners often need to remove other supports from their partner. And this can be done in several different ways. Kind of the classic version of isolation that we hear about is when an abusive partner will make rules about who you are and are not allowed to see and who you are and are not allowed to have contact with. A different version is that maybe there aren't rules, but when you go out together with friends, with family, the abusive partner acts like a jerk. They might start arguments either with you or with your friends or family members. They might do things that are really embarrassing. They might embarrass you in front of others or put you down in front of others. And so it starts to feel really uncomfortable to be in public when this is going on. And you might actually make the decision to start to back away from connecting with some of those relationships. And so that's also a version of isolation. And then a third version of isolation is when friends and family members, coworkers, neighbors start to see what's happening in the dynamics of your relationship, and it's making them really uncomfortable. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to intervene, and it's painful for them to watch. And so they back away and kind of withdraw their support or withdraw their connection to you. And that's also a version of isolation. Manipulating and gaslighting. So playing mind games. Gaslighting is really referring to a tactic where an abusive partner makes their partner feel like reality is questionable. So they start to second guess their own memories, their own recollections of things that happened. The conversation will be such that, and it's so convincing that you'll start to say to yourself, okay, well, maybe we didn't have that conversation and maybe I'm just making this up or I dreamed it. And so really starting to question your reality, and it can be very crazy making where you start to question your own sanity. Secrecy, so hiding things, whether it's communication with other people, money, information, important documents, things like that. Things aren't open and honest and shared. Information is power, and often abusive people will be secretive about that information. Threats and intimidation. So these could be outright, if you don't do this, there's going to be this really big consequence. Or it could be more covert. It could be posturing. It could be kind of hinting at these consequences. And intimidation can be a very effective tactic because it makes your imagination wander. And it makes you start to think, if they're capable of this, what else are they capable of? Sometimes intimidation can look like maybe they've never been physically violent with you, but maybe they've punched a wall or maybe they've broken dishes. And again, it starts to make you wonder if they're capable of that escalating further. Coercion. So being talked into doing things that you don't want to do or put into impossible situations where no isn't really a choice. And that can apply to all types of situations, from sexual situations to financial situations to legal situations. It could even be, I have a client that I worked with in the past who was coerced into signing off on documents that waived her rights to ongoing financial supports that she should have been entitled to. Leveraging status or privilege. So there's lots of different versions of status and privilege in our culture. And so that could be gender privilege, that could be socioeconomic privilege, educational privilege, racial privilege, but utilizing those labels of status to justify abusive behaviors or seemingly give validation for the reason that they get to be in charge. And this can happen in a variety of different areas of status. And then, of course, emotional, physical, or sexual violence in the relationship is clearly abusive. But we list and discuss all of these other potential dynamics of abusive relationships because there's many abusive relationships that never reach a point of physical or sexual violence that are still really significantly abusive. So this graphic is demonstrating 5 areas of characteristics where abusive people tend to be deficient. So these are all qualities and characteristics that we are born with the capacity to develop, and abusive people do not develop these skills well for a lot of different reasons. So in some ways, they're like muscles that were never strengthened and have atrophied. And so kind of starting at the top with humility, this is the idea of recognizing that you're not always right, being humble, being able to keep an open mind and flexibility and listening to what other people have to say and other people's opinions. Next is accountability. So that idea of taking responsibility for your actions, owning your mistakes, following through with making changes in order to make sure that those damages to the relationship don't repeat themselves. Empathy, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, the ability to understand what someone else might be thinking or feeling and why they might be feeling or thinking that way. Self-awareness, the ability to take a step outside of yourself, look at your choices and behaviors and see that there was impact on other people and see how those two things are connected. And then reliability is about follow through. So doing what they say they're going to do and not doing what they say they're not going to do over and over and over again. And so these 5 areas are all areas that abusive people are very challenged and really don't have developed skill in these areas. And as you can imagine, these seriously impact their abilities to have healthy relationships. So I'd like to talk a little bit about when you're first getting to know someone. How do you start to pick up on things that might be really subtle, even in the first date, and how to really read some of these ideas. So the first kind of category of ideas that could be signs of a person who is unhealthy or potentially abusive is love bombing. So abusive people often engage in what are called grooming behaviors early on in the relationship. And so there is a part of our brain called the attachment circuitry. And basically that's about how we connect to other people. And when people make us feel warm and safe and cozy, that part of our circuitry turns off our defenses. So once we've decided that this is a safe person, we aren't as aware and we're not as on high guard in looking for potential signs of danger, and we let that guard down a little bit. And abusive people know this, so they work really hard to make us feel really comfortable and safe and warm and cozy with them really early on. And one of the ways that they might do this is through love bombing. So in this scenario, it's a person who's really, really attentive and charming. Lots and lots of compliments, particularly around areas that you might feel insecure about otherwise. Abusive people can be really skillful at detecting what your insecurities are and really narrowing in on those and giving you lots of compliments and lots of boosting in those areas. And sometimes it feels like a little bit too much. Like they're saying things like, you're perfect. I've never met anyone as amazing as you. You're the only one that I've ever been able to share so much about myself with. And they tend to overshare. So that's another tactic to help you feel like you're making this emotionally intimate connection with them, because typically you don't share really vulnerable personal information with someone you just met. But there's this sense of reciprocating, right? And there's a sense that if someone's sharing this really private, vulnerable information with you, that they feel really comfortable with you and that you need to be very protective and connected to them about it. They might respond, kind of over respond after the date. So receiving multiple texts or calls like on the way home from the date saying, when can I see you again? Or I think I might be soulmates. And so on some level, this is really flattering, right? And it feels great to feel so special and to have so much attention. But it's purposeful, and there's usually a gut sense that this feels like too much, like this is kind of out of the norm, and there's a reason for that. And so we definitely encourage people to listen to those gut instincts. And sometimes even flowers or gift or some other grand gesture the day after the first time you've met them, or really, really early on. So this next category really is kind of the category of a little bit more narcissistic of a person. So this has to do with someone who's presenting as overly confident and really self-assured. And so they might talk a lot about themselves and how great they are. They might sort of take control of the date. So they might make all the decisions about where you're going and not really check in with you about what your preferences are. They might be disrespectful of your time, arriving late, or being heavily focused on themselves, checking their phone. And usually they have some sort of excuse for that, like, oh, I'm just waiting for a really important call from my boss, or, you know, I'm supposed to be getting a raise and I'm supposed to hear the final answer. And so on some level, this is a way of them trying to present themselves as being very high status, being a really great potential partner, but it's also sort of disrespectful and distracting in the date. They might even order your meal for you or kind of tell you what to order and say, oh, this is so great, you have to try it. They might brag or boast about their accomplishments. And then oftentimes this is a person who also seems to nitpick a lot. So they might have sort of side comments about the service, the food, the weather, their work. And if somebody is talking about past relationships and referencing their crazy ex-partner or this really, really difficult breakup, and it's all sort of getting blamed on the other person, these are potential red flags of someone with maybe a more narcissistic set of qualities. And then another subgroup of potential red flags is folks that really elicit a lot of caretaking from you. So in general, our survivors that we work with tend to be really kind, compassionate, generous, caring people. And they tend to be people who are caretakers in their lives, even professionally. And so this subtype of person is really good at detecting that caretaking element of you and sort of elicits that. So this is a person who's always dealing with bad luck. They might share about how they're constantly being mistreated by other people. They might even appear deeply wounded, depressed, or disheveled or disorganized. This is the person that dropped their phone and it broke on the way to the restaurant after they got a flat tire. They might appear apologetic, but there's also this element that they don't seem to take responsibility. And there's lots of excuses, and sometimes this sense that they are identifying themselves as kind of a victim of the world. Like they always seem to find themselves in places where people are mistreating them, or they got kind of the short end of the stick. So some personality characteristics in addition to those 5 areas of deficiency to look for. People who are really charming, clever, and skilled at loopholes, avoiding consequences or getting caught. So these are the people that are always getting out of tickets for speeding. These are the people that are maybe involved in some questionable business deals, but seem to always kind of come out on the other side. So you might hear some stories about that in the early on in the relationship. Someone who has self-centered or narcissistic qualities. So someone who really seems to have a hard time kind of thinking about other people, or those empathy components, or just really seems to kind of see themselves as above others. They might possess an entitled, privileged, or superior attitude. So really just believing that they deserve the best things in life more than other people do, and that they are kind of superior to other people. Maybe someone who's using any kind of intimidation, threat, or anger, especially in the first couple of dates. This is a huge red flag. Somebody who seeks control over other people and acts in an authoritative way. So this may come out, not just in your interactions with them, but as you see them interacting with other people, whether it's servers at a restaurant, whether it's other people that are waiting in line, whether it's their coworkers or their subordinates at work. A person who's possessive and easily expresses jealousy. So if some jealousy seems to be coming out really early on, like in the first couple of dates, that's very concerning. Someone who has unpredictable mood swings or personality shifts. So often what's described is this sense of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So one day they're super carefree and easy breezy, and then the next day really moody and short and irritable. And it seems like a whole different person. That is potentially a bad sign. And then someone who's just emotionally unhealthy or immature and emotionally dependent. So someone who kind of depends on other people to regulate them or take care of them when they're upset. So not what would be a typical reaching out for support, but sort of expecting that you're going to fix it for me. Or someone who has a really hard time even identifying or expressing their emotions, having emotional conversations, discussing topics with emotional content, and sort of resists that. That can also be a red flag. So what are some good signs? How do you know you found a person who's potentially healthy, a potential healthy relationship? So some signs of that would be shared decision-making and planning the date. They want to know what you would like to do, things you like, things you don't like, if you have any food allergies, if you have any preferences, making sure that the date is convenient for you, location-wise, time-wise, date-wise, etc. And that they are checking in with you to make sure that you feel comfortable at different points throughout the date. That both people express genuine interest in each other. It shouldn't really be a question when you leave the date whether or not it went well. That people should feel pretty comfortable in being able to detect if someone was genuinely interested in what they had to say, if they felt genuinely interested in what the other person had to say. There's a natural give and take in conversation. So both people have a chance to talk, both people have a chance to listen. People are asking each other meaningful questions, but not intrusive questions, not really deeply personal questions right away. Trust has to be built over time. Trust and sharing and vulnerability should be a gradual process. And as people get to know each other and feel more comfortable with each other over time, they start to share a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and kind of watch how the other person responds to that. Are they responding in a non-judgmental way? Are they responding in a supportive and understanding way? Are they being protective and respectful of the information that you've shared with them? The person shares the information that's appropriate for the level of trust. So in the first 5 minutes of the date, you shouldn't know the person's whole life story, and you shouldn't feel compelled to share your whole life story. And there's Transparency around intentions, no mixed signals. So you know where it's heading. You know if it looks like you're going to have another date. You know if this is a person who's actually interested in a long-term relationship or if they just want to have some fun. And you feel really comfortable being open and honest about what your intentions are. So people aren't doing one thing and saying something else. So in terms of awareness, we enter into dating and getting to know people, and we're carrying a lot of old messaging in with us. And so one of the factors can be around socialization, particularly around gender stereotypes and roles. So this is maybe in more of a heteronormative kind of perspective of a male-female relationship. But this idea of what constitutes a good man or a good woman and what's a normal expectation, quote unquote, of a man or a woman, and what is outside of those typical cultural boundaries. So for example, for a woman, oftentimes the characteristics that come to mind for people are things like nice, quiet, peaceful, peacemaking, right? And then outside of that box might be things like assertiveness, directness, aggressiveness. And when people step outside of those boxes of what has been determined as a gender stereotype, people get really uncomfortable sometimes. And there are choice words that we call women who are really direct and confrontational. And so knowing that heading in, what are your own biases around what constitutes the type of person that you're attracted to? And then what are other messages that we've received from our families, from our culture, from media, from faith organizations, from friends about what a relationship is supposed to look like? We get lots of really pathological messaging about relationships from romantic comedy movies and media in general. Oftentimes what is displayed as being really romantic is really about really not respecting other people's boundaries. And so being aware that that messaging is in there somewhere, and really kind of resorting back to, does this feel right and safe and healthy for me? Being aware of what you may have listed as a person who's good on paper. So sometimes we can fall into, either from socialization or our own experiences, this idea of, somebody with a good job, somebody who makes a lot of money, somebody who has a certain level of education, and we forget about the qualities and characteristics that are actually really important in order to have a healthy relationship. Because unfortunately, as we well know, people who make a lot of money and are really well educated and have a great job can still be incredibly abusive. That's not, that doesn't preclude from running into a person who's not healthy. So just becoming really familiar about the pros and cons of what I'm drawn to. So oftentimes we tend to connect with people who seem really similar to other people from our lives. We tend to be uncomfortable with things that aren't familiar to us. And so if you have your own personal history, either of traumatic relationships, if you've had a previous IPV relationship, then recognizing that you may be drawn to people who are really similar to that ex-partner who was abusive because that feels familiar. And so that is something to kind of really be aware of and maybe even talk with somebody about to really identify, like, what are those characteristics and qualities and patterns that I'm drawn to and why, and what do I want to be different? Boundaries are really important as you're heading into developing a healthy relationship. You can think about boundaries as rules, principles, expectations of what we will or will not consent to. And there's so many areas where we can identify personal boundaries. So we might have boundaries around our finances or around our resources. We might have physical boundaries boundaries. And those all connect to where is my line of what's okay with me and what's not okay with me, what makes me feel uncomfortable. And usually when someone's starting to push against your boundaries, there's a very physical response and a very instinctual response that we have. It starts to feel really uncomfortable. And when you set a boundary with a healthy person, they say, oh, okay. When you set a boundary with an unhealthy person, they push against it. And when you set a boundary with an abusive person, they also often become abusive and might engage in tactics to get you to get rid of your boundaries. And so boundaries can be really helpful in determining the health of your relationship and how healthy the person is that you're interacting with. Feeling like you can really assertively set your boundaries with that person. So how do you read these signs and trust yourself? So a first step is really exploring, what are my boundaries in those areas that were listed? Have I really thought about what my financial boundaries are with another person? Am I comfortable lending money to my partner? How much money am I comfortable lending to my partner? Am I comfortable co-signing on a loan with my partner or not? And how do I make sure that I'm clear so that I can clearly communicate? Exploring and practicing assertive and direct communication. So the healthier of a communicator you are, the more you're able to set limits and set those boundaries and let someone know when you're not feeling comfortable. Let someone know when they are pushing on your boundaries. Making sure that you feel really clear on what are the healthy characteristics of the partner that you want and a healthy relationship the way you want. And so whether you are in a relationship or dating and thinking about getting into a relationship, taking some time to maybe even write these down and think about what is it that I'm actually looking for and what does that look like in day-to-day interactions with a person. Practicing mindfulness, journaling, and other forms of self-expression. So this is really about connecting with yourself, staying in touch with yourself, staying in touch with your feelings, your thoughts, how you're reacting to time with your partner or the person that you're getting to know. Are you feeling comfortable? Are you feeling safe? Are you feeling respected? And connecting with formal and informal resources and support networks. So some resources in Monroe County for survivors. Willow Domestic Violence Center runs the hotline 24/7, and that's available both by phone or by text. You can also, they have a live chat on their website. If you ever needed some support or had some questions even in the middle of the night, they can be a great resource. Our information for Resolve of Greater Rochester is on here. YWCA, SATHI, Lifespan, and the HEAL program at U of R. There's also resources for survivors in surrounding counties. And so if you're watching from outside of Monroe County, there are resources in all of the counties surrounding Monroe County. And these are all on our website as well if you need more information. There's also New York State and national resources, websites, phone numbers, text lines, hotlines. Okay, do we have any questions? So Carly, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
All right, so we had a couple questions, but I think Amy, one person was interested in exploring some symptoms of trauma and noticing after trauma is experienced, are symptoms like forgetfulness, wondering if things like that are common or normal for survivors.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So trauma has a significant impact on our brain, and particularly the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex is really in charge of things like reason, logic, problem solving, organization, sequencing, words, and attunement to other people. When we are under chronic stress and when we are really emotionally flooded, that frontal cortex part kind of goes offline often. And especially when there is repeated traumatic incidents, repeated stress, repeated highly emotionally charged incidents, that part of our brain is often going offline and stays offline longer. And so oftentimes when people have experienced trauma, they report what we call the trauma fog. So memory can be really difficult, keeping train of thought can be really difficult, accessing words and expressing yourself verbally can be really difficult, or even comprehending words from other people. So that is a really common trauma symptom.
And then we had another question. You spoke a little bit about it, but I still want to honor the question that was asked.
Yeah.
So thinking about behaviors in a healthy relationship versus behaviors that you might see in an unhealthy or abusive relationship during early dating. So thinking about love bombing in particular, what would be components of a healthy relationship? What might that look like in a first date? Because I think that what we might notice is that love bombing really may feel like components of a healthy relationship. So maybe some other notes about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think on some level, when we're getting to know somebody, we are in what's considered kind of the honeymoon phase. And so that's the time where naturally we feel a lot of excitement. We want to kind of show our sparkly side and hide our quirks a little bit. We want to put our best impression forward. And we want the other person to know that we're interested. And so there is an element of normalcy and healthy complimenting each other. So, as you're getting to know someone and, like, wow, you're so funny, or, oh, I really appreciate your perspective on that. So a more genuine, healthy kind of area of complimenting is really around your qualities as a person, as opposed to sort of this over the top putting you up on a pedestal. And so that's probably the most significant difference that I would identify between love bombing and what we would expect as some compliments. This love bombing idea really sort of is like, you're basically a god or a goddess, you're like way up above all others. The sun doesn't set for anybody else but you, kind of thing. So it feels a little overwhelming when those kind of compliments are coming, versus really genuine things about who you are as a person that feels really nice, that somebody recognized it. Yeah. Does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, the person who asked said that was really helpful.
Okay.
And that also makes me think about, if we think about like good on paper versus what are attributes or components of a healthy person, like, so thinking about humility, reliability. And so someone else mentioned maybe even like a future workshop or exploring more about boundaries and how we can identify our boundaries and establishing them, which I think is always a really good and thoughtful question.
Great topic. Yes. Thank you. Yes. And, I will be mentioning shortly, but we have many topics that are kind of already identified for some future workshops, but we are always open to suggestions if there's particular workshops that, or particular topics that you think might be really helpful and informative. So thanks for that idea.
We have about 2 minutes left. Do people have more questions? Oh, there's another question that just came in. Okay, yeah, this is a great question. So when a survivor leaves their abusive relationship and then begin to have awareness about abuse and abusive relationships and the components of that, and then you begin to notice those components in other relationships, like maybe even like your family or friends relationships.
Yes. So the question is that typical that happens?
Yes. Or I think more specifically, noticing when your family or friends are in abusive relationships.
Oh, I see. Okay. So yeah. So I think, certainly as part of our therapy, we do a lot of information and education with our clients about identifying kind of the spectrum of relationships. And certainly as you start to recognize what those tactics are and what those elements are, they start to show up all over the place. So it might be in your own life, with coworkers, with friends, with neighbors, in your family, but you might also notice that your friend or family member is in a relationship that maybe isn't as healthy either. And it can be really hard when you're in a much different place than they are to try to talk to them about it. And so, expressing your concern and sharing some of your own experience and what you've learned about can sometimes plant some seeds for that person, and offering, resources that were helpful to you at the beginning of your journey as you were first trying to identify if what was going on was okay or not. So sometimes people start with websites or books or podcasts. Sometimes people start by reaching out to a place like Resolve. And so if there's things that you found that helped you, sharing those with others as well.
And I think the question may have actually have been what you started to touch on too, noticing that other people in your life may treat you in unhealthy or abusive way. And so I answered to that person. And just to clarify too, that it's also quite common too, that you start to see other relationships that are not healthy or
Right. And often, as what we find when we're working with people, is that there were factors that created some vulnerabilities for them heading into an abusive relationship. And so sometimes those are already established relationships where maybe some of those dynamics became kind of normalized or common for them. And so it didn't seem that different heading into an abusive relationship. And so that's one of the things that we really try to work on is, what are those areas of vulnerability or maybe previous trauma that might have created some areas of vulnerability to entering into an abusive partnership?
Yeah. And then our next workshop is November 16th, and it is about, oh yeah, thanks. And if you want to receive emails in the future about the workshops, you could just leave your email in the chat box and then I can collect them.
So it'll be about career counseling, the idea of kind of heading back to work or re-entering the workforce or changing jobs, particularly in the current climate, and some tips and tricks around resumes and interviews and job searching that really apply to the modern job search market, right? And we have a partner expert coming in to provide that presentation. And as always, we encourage you to connect with us on social media. We are on all of these